Good morning, everyone. I can see we've got quite a lot of people joining us, so welcome. Just whilst we're waiting for our panelists, I have put up the QR code to the Newman Trust. So for those of you who joined the welcome, the Newman Trust is a charity that provides holidays to children with disabilities and special educational needs. If you can make a contribution today, we would really appreciate it. If you try scanning the QR code, it should take you to a Just Giving link, but we'll also pop the link into the meeting chat once we get started. We aren't quite due to start yet, but I can see that we have quite a lot of people still joining, which is great. Good to see so many of you. And hopefully our panelists will join us shortly. Okay, so Irit, I can see that you're here.
Uh-huh. Yes.
Both
I,
of you panelists, so hopefully you can talk now.
yes, we joined a while ago and we couldn't really yeah, you didn't see us. We saw you all along.
I'm so sorry. I think sometimes it can be tricky with these scheduled meetings if
Yeah.
different email joins, but you're with us. Um,
Great.
are you both sharing the same computer?
We're both sharing the same computer. I don't know how to share our presentation.
Okay, so let's see. Just going to try promoting you to panelist again.
Mhm.
Okay, so I've had a notification saying that you're joining as a panelist, which hopefully
Oh,
we
great.
are. We can see you.
Oh, perfect. Amazing. All right, so now do I share screen?
If you can, yes, give it a try and we'll see how
Host disabled participant screen sharing.
it is. One of the unfortunate things doing a conference online. Let me just see if we can help that. Okay.
Try again.
Yeah, you should be the host of the meeting now. So fingers crossed, you should be able to do what you need to do.
Yeah. And hold on. Wait a second. It's I'm gonna try again. There we go. I think now it should, no, it doesn't share the correct thing. Sorry, you. Give us
Not
a second to try and. Okay. It might, yeah, it might work now. I'm just going to try and do that again.
great stuff.
Sorry about that.
That's quite all right.
What can you see now? Can you see
So we can
station?
not currently. Anna, do feel free to jump in if you can. What I could see here it was a browser tab. So if you try,
Okay, hold on. Then in that case, okay, hopefully. Are you seeing the presentation now?
yes.
Yeah.
Okay, woo.
Got there.
As if it's not stressful enough to give a presentation, but okay, let's do a slideshow from beginning. And you can see it now properly?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm sorry that was a bit of a clunky start. Welcome to all of you who've joined. I can see there's 118 people in the room, so that is absolutely fantastic. Because we've had a few technical difficulties, I'm just going to hand straight over to you guys if that's all right and let you crack on. But
Great.
in time, we'll be in the background if you need anything from us.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you, you. So hi, good morning. Sorry for the clunky start, as you said. My name is Irit and this is Beth. I'm a therapist and Beth is a BCBA. We both work for a company called I Support Behaviour, which is a small consultancy agency. We support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Normally what we do is we get cases and we do FBAs, and then from there we might make recommendations and then support the organization to implement those recommendations. So we really get cases that we support for between 3 months to a year. And so on the slide, you can see some of the values of I Support Behaviour. At the center of what we do is professional excellence and co-production, and we'll talk a little bit today about co-production. And we're going to present a case today that we worked with. So today we'll present a case study of an individual that we worked with, and this is a case study that we thought we would share with you to demonstrate how we supported an autistic adult to recover from debilitating trauma and to re-engage in meaningful quality of life enhancing activities. So we'll really talk about a little bit about the intersection between anxiety and autism, and explore how behavior analysts in particular or PBS practitioners can support individuals with severe anxiety or trauma. And we'll talk a little bit about how a multidisciplinary approach and co-production in particular can support trauma recovery. So just to start with some interesting statistics on autism and mental health. As you can see, anxiety disorders are the most common mental health challenges that autistic people experience. And also, they are much more common in autistic people than the rest of the population. The person we chose to present today has a diagnosis of OCD and social anxiety. But essentially, you know, we look at all of these things as well from a trauma perspective. And there's plenty of literature on trauma vulnerability factors for autistic people. So the person we're going to present doesn't have a diagnosis of PTSD as such, but there are many vulnerability factors that led us to assume trauma and to apply trauma-informed care to how we work with this individual. He's been through a lot of traumatic events. So there are events that we assume were traumatic for him. So things like being bullied at school, being misunderstood all of his life, you know, sort of being ostracized and othered by other people. But also on top of that, because of his quite profound sensory sensitivities, the environment is really traumatizing. And so almost like every day is a traumatic event, and every day can be re-traumatizing. Every sort of meeting with the environment can be re-traumatizing for him. So I'm going to over to Beth.
Yeah, so for the purpose of this presentation, we've anonymized the name of the client, but Peter is an exceptionally intelligent man in his 40s. He's a mathematician, a chess player, and classical music lover. Before the crisis, he was living in his own flat, studying in university, regularly playing tennis and chess, and being supported by staff with day-to-day living skills. So, for example, things like doing his shopping and planning his day. Peter was impacted by social anxiety and OCD. However, this was effectively managed by the support he was getting from both his staff and his family, especially his mother, whom he was really close to. Unfortunately, when Peter was referred to us, he'd pretty much stopped functioning and had stopped living his life. So in order to understand the context of the crisis that Peter found himself dealing with, it's important to understand how different experiences intersect and influence each other. To begin with, Peter is autistic and extremely sensitive to his environment, both in relation to the people and other stimuli. He, for example, cannot tolerate eye contact. He also has severe medical conditions such as Crohn's disease, which causes him pain. Peter really struggles with his executive function. It's extremely difficult for him to order his day, to the point where thinking about whether it's more urgent to use the toilet or to eat can take him hours to decide. Time awareness is also a struggle, and he can lose hours thinking about one decision. And by the time he has decided, the choice may no longer be relevant or available anymore. He's also got a diagnosis of OCD, which centers around contamination anxiety and the rituals required to alleviate it. This heightens his social anxiety as he is anxious about the social aspect of interacting with others, as well as them contaminating him. He has always found certain aspects of life really challenging, so when his environment became more challenging, it was a breaking point for him. So here we can see on the left-hand side of the slide, on the blue part, you can see that all the vulnerability factors and influencing factors to the crisis. Peter is extremely sensitive to his environment, and so every interaction, every eye contact, every verbal exchange is extremely taxing for him. He finds changes in the environment and noise extremely difficult to process. His learning history has taught him that human interaction is aversive and even dangerous. So he was struggling to navigate his fears, his sensory and physical pain, and then on top of that, the pandemic made his worst fears of contamination come true. His physical environment at the time was not suitable for him. He was living above a noisy street, and so he moved in with his family. At this point, his mother, who is the one person in the world that understood him, became terminally ill, and he found himself completely paralysed. His needs became too complex for his support workers to meet. His support was stopped, and he essentially stopped engaging in any activities, and even eating became extremely difficult.
So when we were asked to work with Peter, we had to consider whether that's something for us, whether that's something that we can do. And, you know, we always ask ourselves as practitioners whether we're the right, you know, people to help that person ethically. And essentially, Peter wanted to get back his life, and he wanted to move to his own house from the family home where he's moved to during the pandemic. So for that, he had to face some of his greatest fears, and he had to relearn the skills that he lost, and he had to change some of his behaviors. And this is a really hard thing to do when you're anxious and traumatized, because although anxiety and trauma are very difficult concepts to operationalize, as a therapist, I would say that functionally, anxiety is a coping strategy for trauma and for unmanageable overwhelm. So if we experience something as extremely aversive, becoming hypervigilant is a protective measure. But what happens to our brain when we're constantly on survival mode is that we turn off our learning brain. In order to learn, for example, we need to be okay with not knowing. We need to be curious. We need to tolerate ambiguity. Whereas the survival brain requires the exact opposite. It requires us, to, you know, it's like no room for mistakes. It requires no ambiguity whatsoever. And so teaching skills to a person who's highly anxious, it can be really tricky. And Peter almost needed to relearn how to live his life practically and cognitively, which is a huge challenge. And we needed to ask ourselves whether we can do that ethically and in terms of our skill set as a company that delivers positive behavior support. So going to that, as you know, as most of you would probably know, in 2002, the International Journal of Positive Behavioral Support published the State of the Nation report about positive behavior support in the UK. And it drew a lot of attention, it drew a lot of debate around whether positive behavior support is intended for neurodivergent people who don't have a learning disability. And Peter is a really good example for someone who doesn't fit this description of a typical positive behavior support target audience. But after considering, we've decided to take on this case with the key decision that co-production must be a central part of the work, and that therapy, some sort of psychological input or therapeutic input should also be part of the work alongside the behavioral goals that he wanted to achieve. So this is pretty much why we have decided to take the case on. Peter engaged in psychological therapies in the past, but it wasn't really leading to a significant change, because it was almost like isolated therapy sessions aimed at helping Peter process trauma and, you know, mentalizing what has happened to him, but it was missing the component of consistent therapeutic support to achieve behavioral goals that Peter didn't know how to do, and he also didn't know how to generalize what he was you know, what he was doing in therapy outside the therapy room. So as a result, services started withdrawing from him and started saying that they couldn't support him. And often people fall in between the chairs where, you know, mental health services say, oh, we don't have the autism expertise, so we can't support this person. And autism services say, well, the main presentation is mental health, so we can't support this person. And he wasn't really finding the help that he needed. He was able to express his will to engage with us, and he was also able to define his goals, where he wanted to get to, and he really needed some support to get that done. So we've decided that we could use our evidence-based knowledge to help him lead change, whilst also being really therapeutic and trauma-informed and mindful of his psychological needs.
So we decided that if co-production is central to the work and then there's a multidisciplinary approach, we can ethically offer Peter support. We also decided to involve a clinical psychologist for additional clinical supervision. And we started looking at the function of Peter's escape behaviours, and they were to avoid aversive internal stimuli. For example, avoiding tasks that evoke scary thoughts about contamination. We wanted to ensure that our verbal interventions were not reinforcing and colluding with his anxiety behaviours, as this would stop him from progressing. However, this was a balance, as at the same time, we didn't want to challenge Peter in a way that was not empathetic or in a way that could be re-traumatizing. And this is where we constantly listened to the feedback from Peter and made adjustments in our approach accordingly. Because of anxiety, Peter had lost fluency in a lot of previously mastered skills. For Peter to remaster these skills, he needed to be in an environment that evoked a manageable and workable level of anxiety that allowed Peter to practice these skills so that they could be remastered and generalized again. Once this was achieved, we could move on to supporting Peter to achieve targets that he had not had the opportunity to explore before. So our plan of work consisted of a 3-phase approach. Phase 1 consisted of rapport building, person-centered planning and co-production to provide insight into Peter's expectations, values and goals towards a meaningful life, providing support to consider short and long-term goals that will improve his well-being, and supporting Peter in building rapport with potential support workers. Phase 2 consisted of skill acquisition. So we were focused on the autonomous life skills such as shopping, banking, personal care, and these were supported by the behaviour analyst. On the job coaching of support staff, completing the skills with Peter too. Counselling sessions to help support Peter to progress and to process the anxiety he felt while stretching himself to complete these targets, and training the family and wider circle of support on how to meet Peter's needs. Finally, phase 3 focused on the transition into his new property, ensuring skill maintenance and further supporting the generalization of skills so that Peter had autonomy and so the care provider could meet his needs without requiring our additional input. So co-production was at the centre of the approach, and therefore it was important to conceptualise our work with Peter in a way that Peter understood it. So Peter also felt that it was a 3-stage approach. He described the first stage as ending the deterioration and getting out of the hole. The second stage is climbing the mountain, and the third stage is establishing himself and looking to the future. Our approach used evidence-based behavioural methods to target Peter's long-term goals by working on realistic, practical and achievable skills. We also needed to be present with Peter and adjust our approach based on Peter's immediate needs and presentation. We ensured that we constantly validated Peter's experience and listened to his anxieties whilst continually encouraging him and supporting Peter towards his goals. This meant being realistic about the pressure to diminish anxiety completely and supporting Peter to see that he could feel anxious and still succeed as long as he was supported effectively. Flexibility was key. Sometimes we needed to put the goals we had set as a practitioner to one side so that we could go with Peter's priorities, even if they didn't seem logical to us. We needed to support Peter's logic. An example included when I arrived for a session expecting to work towards Peter like leaving the house and going to the back garden as an initial step. However, Peter was really motivated to get his glasses repaired. So he wanted his first trip outside of the house to be to the opticians. So that's what we made plans for. Initially, we focused on sleeping, eating and toileting first to help Peter establish a daily routine. However, I constantly listened out for opportunities to make progress on other skills. This included Peter and I chatting about how he loved chicken soup and me offering to go and buy the soup there and then, opening Peter up to start targeting shopping as a skill alongside the other things that we were working towards. So anxiety is not an area that behaviour analysts typically provide interventions for. However, it is typical for behaviour analysts to support autistic populations. And as previously referenced, the comorbidity of autism and anxiety disorders is very high. The field of behaviour analysis now has a much greater understanding of verbal behaviour, anxiety, and impacts on behaviour. Hayes's research, for example, conceptualizes how humans have the capacity to derive relations between events that lead neutral stimuli to indirectly acquire discriminative functions. Furthermore, we now have a greater understanding of how private events themselves can acquire discriminative functions, and that anxiety disorders develop with minimal, obvious direct learning, but result in huge disproportionate levels of responding. And finally, we understand that the primary function of anxious behaviour is experiential avoidance. If you'd like more information on behaviour analysis and anxiety, I'd recommend looking at the research on acceptance and commitment therapy and a liberated mind by Stephen Hayes. And we've got some resources and links at the end of the presentation. Okay, so now is your first secret code word for your CEUs. So it's DOC, which is DOC, DOC. Great, hopefully everyone's got that. So so back to the presentation. So we started looking at how we were going to operationalize anxiety. And we looked at the window of tolerance as a concept originally developed by Dr. Dan Siegel to describe the optimum zone of arousal for a person to function in everyday life. When a person is operating within this zone or window, they can effectively manage and cope with their emotions. For clients who have experienced trauma, it is often difficult to regulate emotions, and the zone of arousal where they become where they can function becomes quite narrow. We conceptualize this for Peter and the circle of support using the comfort, stretch, and panic model. So the comfort zone is where Peter feels safe. This is where his anxiety is at the lowest. However, it's not an area for growth. And unfortunately, Peter's anxiety was making his comfort zone become smaller and smaller. At the point where our work began, Peter couldn't use multiple rooms in his house. He was unable to sit on any other furniture other than a wooden chair in the kitchen. The stretch zone is where growth can happen. When targeting new or lost skills, Peter will feel uncomfortable. However, with patience and awareness of Peter's anxiety levels, progression on targets can be made, and Peter can move towards a life that he wants to lead. Motivation is key at this stage. When assessing Peter's ability to complete a previously mastered skill at this point, it's a won't as opposed to a can't. And targeting skills that Peter had buy-in for and had chosen to work on was key to progress. However, constant monitoring is required, because what we don't want to happen is for Peter to enter that panic zone. This is where Peter becomes paralysed with anxiety, which can lead to trauma or re-traumatisation and a breakdown in trust. This will lead to safety behaviours and the discontinuation in targeted of the skill, and we might not be able to target that skill again. At this point, the skill is not a won't, it's not motivation, it's a can't. And no matter how invested Peter is in completing the skill, it's no longer achievable and it should be abandoned for now. So to allow me to support Peter in the stretch zone, I first needed to establish myself as in the comfort zone. To do this, I needed to build a strong, trusting therapeutic relationship with Peter. From there, I could start supporting Peter in the stretch zone. And I did this using the following strategies. So I used high probability requesting to build behavioural momentum and to reduce anxiety. Demand management to ensure that the targets were appropriate and achievable given Peter's anxiety at that moment in time. I used mindfulness to bring Peter down if he was becoming too stretched and too anxious, such as, we temporarily abandon the target and listen to his favourite music, And I always listened to Peter's concerns and only chose values that Peter found validating and that were his. Finally, I always monitored the functions of Peter's behaviour to ensure I was reinforcing adaptive behaviours by providing praise and avoiding reinforcing maladaptive behaviours. I'll talk about some of these techniques in the following slides. So as I mentioned before, high probability requesting was used to build behavioural momentum. This was implemented while constantly monitoring for signs of anxiety. As you can see in the graph, at the point where behavioural momentum is at the highest and the anxiety is at the lowest, this is the perfect time to start stretching Peter and to really go into that stretch zone. The functions of behaviour consisted of attention maintain behaviours such as reassurance seeking and escape behaviours, such as the negative reinforcement achieved by the ritualistic cleaning, and these would temporarily reduce the negative thoughts that he was having. This all led to a short-term reduction in anxiety. And if not reinforced, the long-term effects meant that Peter would go into crisis and would not be able to sleep, he wouldn't be able to eat, he wouldn't be able to he would be paralyzed, and he wouldn't be able to look after himself. However, Peter was desperate to live a life with meaning, and therefore this was a constant battle between supporting his executive function skills, mediating the OCD, taking into account his exceptional intelligence, his anxiety, and the fact that he was autistic, and still helping him achieve his goals so that he could progress to a life with meaning. And for Peter to do that, it meant that he would have to cope with some level of anxiety. And again, we needed to mitigate against the reassurance trap. So we needed to help Peter be reassured, as I've just said, he wouldn't be able to progress, and he could not just we couldn't put the reassurance seeking on extinction, as that would have led Peter to go into the panic zone. And there would have been a breakdown in trust, and he wouldn't have wanted to work with me anymore. However, we didn't want to trigger the OCD cycle, as this would lead Peter to become stuck on a skill and wouldn't be able to complete it. With Peter, his reassurance looked like he would ask you to guarantee that he was completely safe and that nothing bad could possibly happen. However, Peter is exceptionally intelligent and would know that you couldn't guarantee that. So therefore, he'd become anxious again. And then you'd get the compulsive behaviour and then the temporary relief, and it would just become stuck instead of successfully completing the skill. Instead, we would support Peter in creating extensive plans before we'd attempt a task and help Peter to predict his own anxiety. Then, when we attempted to engage in a skill, we'd not reassure Peter directly, but instead we would redirect him to the plans we had established, like we'd established fluency in, because Peter was in that comfort zone when we made them, and we'd help him reassure himself, therefore placing the reassurance seeking on extinction and differentially reinforcing Peter effectively reassuring himself. So this was incredibly difficult for Peter, as he'd had a long learning history of seeking reassurance from others, especially from his mom. And it was really important that I established a strong trust with Peter. So the ways that I did this was to pair with Peter by avoiding aversive stimuli. For example, I wore sunglasses in sessions, so Peter knew I would not make eye contact with him. And I would also exaggerate my movements so he could visually see I wasn't touching anything of his. I also constantly listened out for possible reinforcers so that I could pair them with me. For example, supporting him to buy his favourite foods and helping him partake in religious festivals. This adapted interaction style required me to continually not question his logic and to just listen and validate his views. And this pairing was ongoing as I constantly adapted to mitigate against the social anxiety Peter experienced when seeing me, due to it being a social interaction, and pairing myself with a reinforcer to demonstrate to Peter why engaging with me was worth the anxiety that he felt.
Great. So just a couple of slides to sort of conceptualize the therapeutic part of the work. So in terms of the therapeutic elements of the work, I offer Peter counseling for 2 hours every week. But we also had to ensure that the whole ethos of the work was therapeutic. And that his whole team of support staff that started supporting him as we, after we started the work, were therapeutic as well. So you may be familiar with the PERMA model, which is how we sort of conceptualized the work therapeutically. And in our job coaching, we focused on the PERMA component as a priority to ensure that the staff developed positive relationships with Peter, and that the engagement led to positive emotions and meaningful accomplishments. So similarly to what Beth described she was doing, we sort of asked the team to do the same and help them understand why. And, this is not a very straightforward for a person who is extremely socially anxious and has history of relational trauma, like bullying, like being othered, like being ostracized. He was often in his life told that his experience were not valid. So in a way, you're making a big deal of things, or you're being ridiculous. So Beth had to really coach the team to pair with Peter in a similar way to how she did. And we had to build a lot of trust to evoke those positive emotions and engagement, but we also had to hold the meaning for him and the hope for him that he was often struggling to hold for himself, and highlight achievements, because when when you feel that you are so behind, it's very difficult to see small steps as achievements. So we had to use a lot of praise and kind of remind him that there's still time, that he will get where he wants to, and that we're here to support him, and that we believe in him. And he found that really useful, as he couldn't do that for himself. So a big part of coaching the team to work effectively with Peter was teaching them to apply some counseling skills to their practice. So we trained the team to apply things like active listening. I don't know if you're familiar with active listening, but that was really useful for the team. And we also coached them to use some principles from dialectical behavior therapy, primarily the 6 steps of validation, which, validation is part of active listening as it is, but we were kind of more explicit on how to do validation. And, active listening and validation are both evidence-based therapeutic skills shown to be very effective, particularly with people with relational trauma. So things like, experiences of bullying or being repeatedly rejected by other people. And so validation and active listening start to repair the wound around not being understood, not being accepted, not being seen. And then it starts to build trust. And when we have trust, then the person has some sort of sense of safety. And when the person has a sense of safety, they can start reactivating their learning brain, which was our aim.
So one of the biggest obstacles was that the circle of support didn't have much empathy or understanding for Peter, and did a lot of asking, like, why can't he just do it? Why does it take him so long? Why does he need this? So, and etc. So we provided a lot of education to try and explain autism, anxiety, trauma, and really try to explain Peter's experiences. We particularly emphasised how pressuring Peter to do something that he's not ready to do can lead to a short-term gain, so he might do it, but it then slows down the long-term goals, because he'll feel more anxious, there'll be a breakdown in trust, and he'll become paralysed and less likely to progress. So we introduced the concept of comfort, stretch, and panic to help the wider circle of support evaluate Peter's goals, and as well as to help manage their expectations of him. So an example of one of Peter's goals was to visit the optician. So at this point, we'd been working with Peter for a year and he'd not left the house for 4 years. So it was a really complex target. So as a trusted member of Peter's support network, I helped Peter initially plan the stages of going to the opticians. Again, like I said, this was kind of like the green comfort zone thing for Peter to do. He really enjoyed and valued the planning process. And then we started creating a list of mini goals that needed to be achieved before Peter could go to the opticians. And this is where we're transitioning slightly towards the stretch zone, because there's that kind of commitment to have to do something that you know it's not going to be straightforward and potentially will evoke some level of anxiety. So as I say, we began then stretching Peter to complete these mini goals. So they were targeted really slowly and included things like buying items that he needed, like a hat and a face covering, and arranging a time for the visit to happen. And whenever his anxiety levels increased too high, we'd abandon the mini goal so that it could be revisited at a different time. So, you know, it was always better, like less was more, always. And it was always better to leave the session on a success than trying to push Peter to failure. After 1 month of planning and completing mini goals, we attempted the first visit to the opticians. However, during the event, Peter's anxiety levels began escalating, and things was happening that we hadn't planned for, that we couldn't have foreseen. So at this point, we abandoned the attempt. We praised Peter because he'd done amazingly and he'd made so much progress to even do this attempt. And we talked about it in a really practical way and about like what we'd learned from the attempt and what we could do differently next time. And again, paired this with loads of praise because it was so brilliant that Peter had pushed himself to do this. And then this allowed Peter to feel comfortable enough to attempt the visit again the following week. And this time it was completely successful. And we did successfully go to the opticians. So there's loads of anecdotal achievements that were incredible to watch Peter achieve. I've included some on the slide here that's kind of stood out for me. But all of it was really special and helping Peter to achieve things that he'd never really achieved before, and to also get back a lot of the skills that he'd lost. So one of the things that was really special for me was that I really remember when I first started working with Peter that he was so anxious and withdrawn when I first visited. However, like towards the end of our time together, we'd be singing prayers and like celebrating religious festivals together. And he does really good impressions of like Louis Armstrong and stuff like that. And it was wonderful to really see him like come out of his shell and really embrace life. So. And I really wouldn't have thought of any of these things were achievable at the start. And for a while, progress was so slow, and however, it shows that as long as you work slowly and using co-production, it is possible. When I started working with Peter, he explained that the growth would be incredibly slow at first, and then there would be exponential growth, because he is a mathematician after all. And that's exactly what happened. He was exactly right. So yeah, here's your second and final CEU code word, which is Ursula. So URSULA. Brilliant.
Great. So we thank you for listening, and sorry for the bumpy start. We put some sources of the models that we mentioned throughout the presentation, in case it's useful to you. There's loads of videos and materials out there if you search. So yeah, these are just some examples, but thank you. And if you have any questions, then I guess we've got a few minutes, Hugh, right?
Yes, we do. Thank you so much, guys. Before we move on to questions, I will just jump in with a few little bits because, as you say, we had a bit of a clunky start, which means didn't actually kind of go through everything with everyone. But thank you so much, guys. I certainly have some questions. The first thing that I would say to everyone who's been with us, though, is again, apologies that I haven't given you a kind of thorough overview at the start, and I'm aware that the chat function hasn't been working. So the first thing that I would say is the Q&A function is working. So if you do have any questions, please start popping them into the Q&A. And in the meantime, I will just put some information into the chat once I have reclaimed the host. So just bear with me 1 second and we'll see if we can sort out that chat issue. So good. Okay, so everyone should now be able to see the chat. In terms of the keywords, so CEUs are available for this talk. Hopefully you caught the keywords. If not, pop us a message in the chat because I'm aware that I haven't kind of properly introduced this. What I'll also do is place a link into that chat window, which will then allow you to go to the webpage where you can claim CEUs. There is a charge for CEUs, I'm afraid, so the conference is free, but if you want CEU certificates, there's an £8 charge. What you will also need to do is in the notes section, include the 2 keywords, include your email address, and also include the name of the presentation. But as I said, we'll make sure that those things are posted into the chat shortly. And in the meantime, we do have some questions. So let me see. Okay, so the first question we have. So if someone is unable to identify targets and goals, so to initiate this process, so for example, low motivation for accessing the community, any kind of thoughts in terms of how we might approach that?
Yeah. So I'm guessing it really depends on the client. So if they're a verbal client, then there's so many ACT kind of style ways of identifying values, and you can really break down the skill. So for example, one that I like to use is imagining that you've won the lottery, and that the person then, and you ask the person what they would spend their money on. And from that, you can start to tease out kind of values, and you can start to group those things together from those things. And you know, how people access their community and stuff like that, you know, it varies. So for example, I love going to the gym. So my way of socializing with other people and accessing my community is to have a good community in the gym. Whereas I've got friends that they can't think of anything worse than, you know, joining a gym and having their community that way. So I think trying to leave behind any assumptions that we have, you know, and not, and although it's sometimes good to suggest things, and if you do have a client that's very similar to you, it can be handy to go, well, this is what I enjoy, so maybe you enjoy it as well. But I think try not to be rigid in your approach and really let that it be person-centered and they lead the conversation. And as I say, even if it starts off with just small activities, talking about the things they do currently like, and you expand from there and start like establishing values from there, it can be a really good way to start.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, I think we stressed it a lot in the presentation, but I can't stress anymore the importance of rapport building, because sometimes it's just about being with a person. And a lot of the time people when asked, they're so used to answering other people's questions and professionals who come and say, what do you want? And what, and actually just taking the time to be with a person and getting to know them and being interested in them, I think can, give space for that rather than kind of being in a rush to know what the person wants or achieving targets. And, I know that a lot of the clients that we work with don't talk or, or really don't know or, have completely different lives. So I think sometimes just being and building the rapport with and trying different things together, it doesn't have to be going out in the community, like just, being and talking about things can be really, really significant for people, getting to know them, being interested in them. That's also part of the co-production process.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys. So I do have a few more questions coming in, which is great. A couple of you have raised your hand. I'm afraid because this is a webinar, we can't enable microphones. But if you use the Q&A function, we can see your questions as they come in there. Again, apologies about the difficulties with the webinar chat. This should now be resolved. So for those of you who are asking questions about claiming CEUs, please do look in the webinar chat section. I'll also bring up a QR code once we finish questions. But the next one we have for you guys, particular question about co-production with profound and multiple learning disabilities or people who don't communicate vocally. Any kind of thoughts about how you might approach co-production in those circumstances?
Yeah, I think I touched upon that a little bit in the previous answer, that sometimes being and doing stuff because people tell us stuff through their behavior. So for example, I've worked with clients who stuff just didn't do much activities with or didn't offer engagement because they didn't know, because the person couldn't say, so they didn't know, so they just opened the television or whatever. And so a lot of exploration together, and the activities that the person appreciate can tell us about other things that they might appreciate. The interaction style that they appreciate might tell us about what other, what interaction style other people can apply. So it's not so much PBS co-production with the elements of PBS, but it's almost like gathering this information non-verbally through interacting with people. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to say.
I think one thing that I always try and say to when I'm providing coaching for support staff and other people that support individuals is say yes as much as you can. If it can happen at a certain time, if the client is showing signs that they like it to happen at a certain time, then let's create environments where it can happen at that time. People who aren't typically supported and typically developing people, we have so much say over how we get ready or how we do any element of our life, even from like our getting dressed routine. Some mornings we shower, some mornings we do different things with our hair. Like there is so much control that we have over those things, whereas sometimes in settings that control and that choice is diminished. So if there is something where you can reorder the way that they're doing their routine, even just small things like that, like I say, if you can say yes, if it is possible to happen, then let them lead the way and let them do as they will.
Great, thank you so much, guys. So we've had a couple of questions coming through just where people have said how much they enjoyed the presentation. So thank you for that. The next one really relates to supervision, I suppose. Really interested in the approach to addressing anxiety and OCD.
Mhm.
And the participant mentions that you had some supervision from a clinical psychologist. Are you able to highlight the additional kind of non-CBT elements of the intervention you used that you feel made a difference for Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an integrative therapist, so I'm influenced by different modalities, and I never think kind of dogmatically about, you know, one model to work with an individual. So, you know, I'd always think about attachment theory to help me conceptualize what happens between us. We mentioned that we used elements of DBT, ACT. So naturally we're sort of go with those kind of modalities, the behavioral modalities, but really, you know, I think it's just thinking therapeutically about the person, and yeah, so we mainly used, I think, the principles of DBT, ACT, not so much CBT, to be honest.
He had a learning history of CBT, and it had
Yeah.
not been effective with how it, so I think we actively kind of avoided it, didn't we?
Yeah, I mean, all of these modalities are kind of cousins, so it's not, you know, but I guess a lot of, in my experience, a lot of autistic people complain that CBT didn't work for them, and I think what they find that didn't work was that they felt that they're being asked to think differently. And people who have been told all of their life that, you know, something is wrong with you, you're not behaving properly, and you need to change everything about you. Now you also, your thoughts are wrong, and you need to, you know, restructure your thoughts. That's really difficult. And actually, you know, sometimes asking somebody with profound trauma to think differently, and then everything would be less traumatizing, that can be really devalidating. So we're actually just staying with him. And often he would say, well, yeah, that's really difficult for me, or I can't do that. And we wouldn't say, well, no, you need to think about it differently. Or, you know, we would just stay with the difficulty that, yes, this is really, really tough, and we're here together. So that was kind of the essence of the therapeutic relationship. I often think more about the therapeutic relationship rather than which techniques from which modality or which framework, but more kind of what kind of relationship, what kind of therapeutic relationship do we do here?
Thank you so much, guys. We are starting to run out of time. We do have a couple more questions coming in. But what I'm going to do is just start sharing some of the QR codes whilst hopefully we can carry on with some of those questions. So just bear with me 1 second whilst I try and bring up what we need to do. Okay, so hopefully you should all now be able to see a QR code relating to claiming CEUs. So if you'd like to, please do scan it and follow it. I have included information in the chat, but you'll need the 2 code words. You'll also need to enter your email address and the name of the presentation. I think we've probably got time for a couple more questions. The last thing I'll do is share the link for the Newman Trust, which is the charity that we're collecting for today. But one question from a participant, guys, which was just about the timeline. So kind of how long did it take you to reach some of these goals with Peter? And also, are you still working with him?
Yeah, so the timeline's quite an interesting question. There was nothing linear about this case. It was all kind of, I really tried to just go with whatever Peter was motivated with. So I remember, for example, the soup, when I went and bought him soup, that was like in our second session, because we were sat there and he was just chatting and reminiscing and saying how lovely it would be if he could have the soup right now. And it was kind of like, right, let's do it. Like, well, I can do it. Like, so yeah, so some of the targets were kind of achieved really quickly. I think we've been working with Peter now for just over a year, and we're at the point now where he is transitioning into the new place. We're likely to be working with him for another couple of months, and then we'll kind of hand over to the care provider. And yeah, like I say, there really wasn't a linear and we really did just listen to what Peter wanted and went with that. How I describe it is that I kind of held onto the rope at all times for this like long-term like plans and stuff, while equally kind of seeing the mini plans and how they would slowly work their way towards the longer term things.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, we are almost out of time. So what I'm going to do is just share one last image. If I can get to the share button. Here we go. Okay, so I've mentioned this a few times now, but the Newman Trust is a charity that we are collecting for today. So hopefully this is now visible on your screen. So if anyone does want to make a donation, that would be hugely appreciated. But the last thing that I will say today is thank you very much to Irit and Bethany. I really appreciate it. Again, apologies about the slightly clunky start. I know from experience, it's disconcerting that can be when things kind of don't start so easily. And to all of you who joined us, I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you so much. And again, apologies about the lack of meeting chat. But hopefully you'll be joining us for some of the sessions later in the day. And that's everything. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.